You are familiar now with creating a VM, whether that be within ESXi right in here, or whether vCenter is your preferred login method. But now you're configuring VMs. Perhaps you didn't know that when you're creating a new VM, you could do a little drop down area right here and select thin or thick. What is the difference? Why would I use one over another? Thick, let's start with that. Let's say in a physical computer, you're going in and you are installing an 80 gig hard drive into a computer, a physical computer. You've got that operating system recognizes the full 80 gig and can use the full 80 gig and it's all readily available up front. That's essentially what thick is. Thin is you actually allocating an 80 gig disk, but you're not physically giving it the entire 80 gig up front. So for example, you've allocated an 80 gig, so right here for an 80 gig hard disk as my primary, my primary disk for this server, and I'm allocating it as thin provisioned. So then I can go and build Windows Server onto it, for example. Windows does not need 80 gig to run. It only needs a little smaller amount, maybe 20 or 30 gig, let's say, maximum. So the good thing about thin is that you're not allocating the full 80 gig up front. So you can actually, if you have a pool of VMs and you're allocating all of these disks all over the place being thin provisioned, the operating system and the software that's running on that virtual machine will only allocate or use the storage that it needs. And the rest of that storage is free to be used and is not actually being taken up on your physical storage. So for example, you've got some physical hard drives on your ESXi host, or even if you've got them set up on a NFS or iSCSI on a SAN or on a NAS somewhere and you've allocated that and it's been used on your VM, well, it will only use the capacity that it needs. So let's use the example. Let's say Windows and some software that you've installed only needs 20 gig, but you've allocated an 80 gig thin provision. That means potentially 60 gig of that disk, even though Windows sees it and sees a full 80 gig, it's not physically using the entire 80, it's only using 20. So 60 gig can be used elsewhere. It's not physically being taken up by that VM itself. So what's great about this is that you can leverage the storage that you have and not use it all up front. So let's give you another example. I've now got two VMs. One, I want to allocate an 80 gig hard drive. The other one, I want to allocate an 80 gig hard drive. Traditionally, what would you have to do? You'd have to go and grab a 80 gig hard drive, put it inside a physical server, another server you're building, allocate 80 gig hard drive. So you've got 160 gig and they're dedicated for those two. With thin provisioning, I could give 180 and 180, but it doesn't use 160 gig of the storage on my physical storage device, whether that be on my host or whether that be on my NAS or my SAN. So I can actually use the storage between those two VMs. Thick, you're actually allocating that storage and that storage will be dedicated and set aside for that VM. You'll see that right here, I've got lazy zero and I've got eagerly zeroed. So the end goal for both of these thick provisioned versions is really the same, but just to give you a bit of a summary, an eager zeroed, the disks are going to give you better performance and security. It can take up a lot of time to create. Lazy is, well, I'm a little bit more lazy. That's the way that I think about it. It's short time to create, doesn't provide as much speed. So eager being better performance and better security, but takes a lot longer to set up because you're essentially doing a whole bunch of stuff in the background to set it up properly now. While lazy, we're going to be a bit more lazy and we'll set it up as we go in the back end I'm talking about here. So it's good for short creation times, but it's going to be not as fast and a little bit less secure. Okay, so that's when when you're creating a thick or when you're creating a lazy or an eager, consider those two. My general recommendation is to go thin whenever you can, unless you've got a whole bunch of storage. If you've got a whole bunch of storage available, then always go thick, but you're wasting storage. If I've gone and allocated an 80 gig storage to a VM and forever for the next 10 years, it's only going to use 30 or 40 gig, let's say 40 gig maximum, I've wasted 40 gig of that. I could have just set it as a thin, still allocating at 80, But if it only uses 40, then I've got 40 to use elsewhere. You may be thinking, well, what happens when I physically use the storage? Because what you can do, here's a little bit of a gotcha. This is something that a lot of people overlook sometimes, and it's hard to maintain over time. If I've got a limited amount of storage on my SAN and I'm allocating all my VMs with thin, I'm going, great, this is awesome. I'm allocating all this stuff with thin. Over time, those VMs will start to grow, and they may start to use more storage and more storage on your thin provision disks. Remember that now we're starting to use the physical storage on a physical device. So if I've allocated everything as thin and I don't have proper monitoring, or I'm not monitoring the growth of those VMs, what can happen? I can allocate, let's say, I'll give you an example. I've got a 1 terabyte worth of storage on my host available, and I've got a whole bunch of VMs, and I'm going to allocate them 250 gig each. Let's say I've got 5 250 gig hard drives allocated to 5 hosts. So 250 plus 250 is 500 gig. 250 plus 250 is another 500 gig. And then another 250 is 1.25 terabytes. I've only got 1 terabyte worth of storage. So if I'm not allocating or I'm not monitoring my VMs correctly, those 250s times 5 eventually will fill up. And then I don't have more than 1 terabyte of storage physically available. So then I'm going to have a problem because I'm going to run out of storage. So thin is good as long as you are monitoring it correctly. Thick is good if you've got a lot of money and you're able to allocate it, but then you've got a bit of wastage of the disks if you're not using all of that capacity.